In June of 1994, Seacraft Yacht Sales of Seattle, Washington hosted the annual Pacific Seacraft and Erickson Rendezvous at Port Townsend, Washington. Special guest for the weekend was the legendary WIB Bill Crealock, naval architect and designer of many of the boats that attended. We're now pleased to share with you the highlights and moments that made this event so special for us. What follows are excerpts from an interview with Bill on Saturday, and then a formal presentation by Bill on Sunday morning. And now, here's Bill with an answer to that very important question. What do the initials WIB mean in your name?
Yeah, interestingly enough, that's been the most commonly asked technical question this weekend. In England, it's not uncommon to have three initials, though I did come across somebody this weekend here who also has three initials. It's largely a function of how many relatives have to be satisfied. So in my particular case, the eldest son of the eldest son is always called William, so I am officially William Crealock the 13th, which is an unfortunate number. And the second initial I is Ion, I-O-N, which had to satisfy a relative. That's an Irish version of Ian, which is a Scottish version of John. So in a roundabout way, I suppose it's John. And then the third name is a purely family name of Belton, though I did discover a small town in the United States called Belton. I'm afraid it was rather an insignificant town, but that just happened to be a family name, and so that's what the WIB stands for. So that finally answers that major question. I was born in England, though I spent some of my childhood out east in India and in Iraq. But my father and his family before him had been small boat sailors, so it was natural that I got involved. And initially it was when we weren't near an ocean, so all I could do was sail model boats. So that's what first got me interested. And as I grew up, I decided I would like to get involved in the design of them. And at that time, it was very difficult to get a formal education in yacht design. You had to go the route of learning first to design big ships, which was pretty dull, and then work your way down from that. So in effect, that's what I did. I studied big ship design, and I served the usual 5-year apprenticeship in a design office of a shipyard, and at the same time found a source of study in yacht design. So I combined the two, and when I was able to, I worked my way slowly down the ladder into smaller boat design. I found an excellent excuse for going cruising in that I decided that would tell me how small boats behave under ocean conditions. And so with 3 friends, we set out. We bought an ancient cutter, very ancient cutter. It was sound, and sold all our belongings and took off, because fortunately we all had the same philosophy, which was that you retire in your 20s and then you work at the last part of your life. It's no good working hard early and then not being ready to go cruising later on. So that was our philosophy, and that's what we did. And so we were in our 20s, and we were already had got going in our various careers. We got this old boat and set out from England without aiming at anywhere in particular, except that we started off across the Atlantic after going down the coasts of Spain and Portugal and Gibraltar and Morocco and Casablanca and Canary Islands and places like that, with to no schedule, which we figured was a very important part of cruising. We didn't want to keep to any timetable. And came across the Atlantic, but instead of going to the usual area, we went across to Guyana. simply because we didn't know anything about Guyana, so we thought that would be a good place to go to, and spent months there, went up the big jungle rivers where certainly no yachts had ever gone before, and thoroughly enjoyed it, came up through the Caribbean, flipped a coin to decide whether to come up the coast of the United States or to go through Panama, and we were running out of money, and we'd been doing a little work for National Geographic, so we decided to come up to the States and collect the money. And we spent a further 6 months or so in the Caribbean, paused to work there, and eventually ended up in the United States. Now, I then left and joined other friends to cruise through the Pacific, returned back to England after a couple of years in the Pacific, got as far as Tahiti, and then I had to go back, and later came back to the States to visit friends. And somebody asked me to do some design work, and one thing led to another. I never made it back to England, ended up in California, and that was about 35 years ago. Set up an office in Newport Beach in Southern California, started drawing boats, and have been doing that ever since. I believe so important to realize that what decides the form of a boat has to be the particular purpose for which the boat is intended. A boat intended for racing is a completely different animal than a boat intended for cruising, and it should be. If a racing boat is not sailing on the edge of disaster most of the time, then the designer hasn't done his job, because he's missed out on an opportunity to gain that extra second a mile. Whereas on a cruising boat, the focus has to be primarily on arriving, not on whether you arrive 3 hours earlier, but on simply arriving, and not only arriving at a destination, but arriving comfortable, good shape, refreshed, unless you've been unlucky in the weather. In other words, that the passage, getting there, should be part of the fun of cruising. A boat should be as efficient as conditions allow it. But in searching for too much efficiency, you tend then to lose some of the features which give a boat comfort. You lose some of the vital ease of motion, which is such an important part. That it is quite one thing to go out for a week in a boat with a rather fast, jerky motion, and to go, as compared to going out in a boat with a relatively long, slow motion, which allows you to sleep well at night, and which allows you to do things. In our particular boats, right from the beginning, the area that we targeted was that of balance. That has always fascinated me about boat design. Why are some boats easy to steer and some boats not? And some of the great boats in the past, when I've spoken to people who actually sailed them, they said, "My God, yes, it was a beautiful boat, but it tore the arms out of my, arms out of my sockets," and that surprised me. So right from the start, and especially in the 37, this question of balance was one that we certainly devoted more time to than any other single aspect of it. And in the shaping of the underbody and the skeg and the bustle, that was where we attacked it. That was one of the areas we attacked it. What we were trying to make the boat do seems to be what it's done, talking to people who've had it out in, for instance, in bad weather. Specifically, we were aiming at a boat which could run before very heavy seas, maybe under bare poles, at speeds beyond the safety limit, in other words, that would surf and yet be under control, because I look upon that as the worst situation is the danger of broaching and getting rolled. If you get a boat that was safe under those conditions, you don't have to worry much about the rest. And we've had now a number of owners that have been in exactly that situation. And the only negative comments we got were from two owners in identical situations, bare poles, surfing at speeds which are theoretically not possible. One averaged 10 knots for a couple of hours, which is theoretically not possible. He double-checked the charts and the distances, and the other, the needle kept hitting the 12-knot peg. And I've had many other people since then report similar. And the only negative comment was, gee, both owners made it. They were 3,000 miles apart. I wasted money buying a wheel. It was so easy to steer. I was having so much fun, if you can call it fun under those conditions, that I wish I'd had a tiller, because I would have enjoyed it that much more. I would have felt the boat. It was about in the, I always forget dates, it was in the early 70s that I did a boat for no builder, but simply because I wanted to do it, and that boat turned out to be the what is now the Crealock 37, and a builder picked it up, started producing it, ran into financial problems, closed down, and there was a lot of running around and hassles, and eventually it ended up, Pacific Seacraft was able to get the tooling in probably about the mid-70s, and that was the beginning of my association with Pacific Seacraft. And so the subsequent boats have in general, not all of them, followed along the same general line as the 37, which I enjoyed because usually when you do a boat, you do it for a builder, and as a result you have a fair amount of constraints put upon you in the type of boat it was. Now, Pacific Seacraft were very brave to take on a boat of that type because it was against what was considered the sort of boat that a production builder would sell. It had long overhangs, it was not particularly fat, and both these things were strikes against it. The difficulty being that people compare interiors, compare accommodations based on overall length, leaving out the factor of waterline length. So the 37 has fairly long overhangs. People would compare that interior with a shorter overhang 37, whereas really it's more the equivalent of a 35 to 36 foot boat. And the overhangs, of course, serve a purpose, but they do not provide one with any great increase in interior volume. So I admired them for doing that, and partly because of the work that they put into the boat and the quality that they put in, it managed to catch on and so far remains afloat both literally and figuratively. So the rest of the boats have been, we hope, minor improvements on the original model of the 37. And that follows up to the boat we're working on right now, which is a 40, a bigger sister of the 37, and we at least like to think that it's an improvement in some ways on the old 37. What I want to do today is to look at the cruising boat and try and pinpoint some of the questions which come up during the design process, which separate what we look upon as a cruising boat from what you might call a cruiser, racer, or racing boat. We all know they're different, and you know better than anybody else. But what are the factors which come into it which determine what those differences are? First of all, what do we mean by cruising? It's difficult to pin down. Cruising, I think, is the means of going by relatively small boat to a destination of your choice in safety and with pleasure. And that last thing, with pleasure, is a major factor which we'll come into now and again, because if you're not enjoying what you're doing, then why do it? This whole idea of building production cruising boats, which really started with the old Westsail 32. At that time, it was impossible to buy a production cruising boat. There wasn't such a thing in existence. And somebody came to me and they said, you know, do you think there's a market for it? Because until then, if you wanted a cruising boat, you got a custom one done in wood. And so I said, well, might sell a dozen. So he thought, oh, okay, a dozen. And so he said, what I'll do is I'll pick a design which already has a following, which happened to be Atkins' old Eric 32 design, Colin Archer style. He said, I'll make that in fiberglass. Well, it shows how much I knew about it, because you know, they ended up selling 600 or 700 of those, and it was that boat which started the whole idea that you could go cruising. Somewhere I read not long ago that our minds in developing, the first part of our mind to develop about 200 million years ago was the safety instinct. That was the primary thing. Then I believe about 20 million years ago, I can just recall it, the other factors came in, which was the sort of appreciation of enjoyment and that kind of thing. So when you're talking about a cruising boat, primarily still, you're looking at that 2 million year old facet of the mind. Because when you're talking about cruising, and it's very mundane to have to say it, what primarily matters is how you arrive at the other side, and indeed if you arrive at all. So safety has to be the underlying factor, and that's something that has to underline everything one does in connection with a cruising boat. Anything else is fake. I'm going to now try and take each segment of the boat. We'll start with the interior and the deck, the rig, and then hull shape, and look at those and try and pick them apart and see what we give up and what we gain in going towards a cruising sailboat. But just before we get into that, the idea is that a heavy boat has to be slow. For instance, a heavy displacement boat. Well, you simply cannot have a light displacement cruising boat unless on a semi-custom basis for a particular owner who is definitely going to stay light displacement. I always say that there are not light and heavy displacement boats, but light and heavy displacement owners, simply because you get a boat and you start light displacement. So a person says, you know, I really would like a light displacement, high-speed boat. And by the way, you know, I'm a keen scuba diver, and of course I would want a bigger diesel in it and some extra tankage, and we have a 200-book library. And I want to take along a couple of dinghies and that kind of thing. And so whatever he started with a light displacement, but in no way is he going to finish up with it. He's going to end up with a heavy light displacement boat, which is worse than starting with a medium displacement boat in the first place, which is designed to carry all that extra weight. Occasionally you get the very strong-minded individual who gets a light displacement boat, keeps it that way, is prepared to go out without some of the creature comforts, and then okay. But in judging speed, you've got to be very careful. There are two types of speed. There's speed when you go around and you go on a local race, or there's speed on passage. And to illustrate the difference, we had a case, we did the old Westsail 42, which was, you know, one of the first cruising boats, and again had to be very husky, made people feel good, and it was heavy. And one of them was in Tahiti, and also there was a good boat of the same waterline length, which was generally known as a racing boat, possibly a racer cruiser. And so they challenged their friends, another couple, on this racer cruiser and said, we'd like to race you. They were both going to Hawaii. We'd like to race you up from Tahiti up to Hawaii. And the people laughed and they said, you know, you're not serious. You want to race us? Yeah, we'd like to. So they did, and they beat them by a week. And the reason was that on their boat, they were perfectly comfortable sailing the boat to its normal maximum ability. They turned in at night and the boat sailed itself. The couple on the other boat surged off in great style in the first day or two, and then they began to get a bit tired, and they thought, well, maybe we ought to shorten sail a little at night and get some sleep, and that wasn't enough, so then the boat was bouncing around quite a lot. And so then they started heaving to at night to make up on the sleep they'd missed, and gradually they fell further and further behind. So in judging speed, it's speed on passage that counts, not speed on a triangular course. And speed on passage includes comfort. Let's take a look at the interiors. What sort of things does one particularly look at? First of all, there's really no way of getting the ideal interior. First of all, different people have different requirements. Secondly, as the size of the boat drops, for instance, on a 70-footer or something like that, you can pretty well do what you want with an interior. As the boat size drops, you have to take some features and give up others. Now, to me, one of the most desirable features in a boat, which is not one we can put in most of the boats, is a galley which is U-shaped. And by U-shape, I mean U-shape in the fore and aft direction, so that you can stand in a galley, support your hips, and cook with two hands free. That, to me, is very desirable, but in most, especially in smaller sizes, not possible. I remember when we did a custom boat once, the owner insisted on bringing his wife in and have us measure the width of her hips, and then design the galley to match that exactly. And, it's a little difficult to actually give the true width that you measure, 21 inches. So, being gallant, we read 21 and we said 18. And so then we incorporated it in the finished drawing. But anyway, that was the amount of importance he put on that feature of being able to wedge yourself in the galley. And to me, you don't want a tight fit, but if the boat were big enough, some part of that galley would be maybe tapering so that you could get in there and you could do the more romantic things like washing up and that kind of thing in comfort. There are other things. For instance, let's see, I'm no good at drawing on these things. Take a settee. The basic settee dinette shape might be that. Now, it's a very unglamorous shape. It's much more glamorous to have nice sweeping curves, as you see in a lot of the boats, and the table is a fancy shape, and the cushions come round. But if you're actually sitting in a settee at sea, there's not much comparison on which is the more comfortable to sit in. What you want at sea when the boat is rolling a bit is a relatively small radius so that you can kind of wedge yourself into the back and get a little grip with your shoulders. Here it's kind of like a pea on a frying pan or something. You've nowhere to set yourself in. You could be kind of rolling around. So in port, yes, that's great. It looks wonderful. At sea, it's one of the choices we have to make. We say, no, what really matters, this is going to be all right in port too, and at sea it's going to be better. So on a cruising boat, we keep our radii fairly small and say, this looks better in a boat show, but this will be better to live with. Incidentally, that's a factor that we often wrestle with. We always say we have two interiors, the boat show interior and the best interior. We like to get handholds so that you can go up and down the boat and never cross a space where you don't have something to grab onto. Ventilation, of course, becomes an important part on a cruising boat simply because you're more likely to be areas in the tropics. So Pacific Seacraft is excellent on that. And it's an expensive item, the amount of ports, of little hatches and so forth that they put in. Basically, who are the boats aimed at? Because that's an important part of it. The idea is to try and have a boat which, first of all, will be reasonably efficient and satisfying and fun to sail under any conditions, to sail locally or to go long distance. But at the back of the mind, the boats are really aimed at those people, especially who have the thought at the back of the mind that just maybe one day they'll get away from it all and they'll want to go elsewhere, they'll want to go long distance. Not necessarily that they will, but should they choose that, they don't then have to say, gee, I better get another boat to do this because my present boat is not going to be strong enough or fast enough or whatever, or easy enough to handle. So the boat is aimed very much at those people. When we first got together with Pacific Seacraft, the philosophy we adopted there was, because we discussed this quite a bit, was that if somebody came in and said, right, I want a cruising boat, fine. Oh, by the way, my favorite cruising ground is going back and forth up Cape Horn, let's say. We then didn't have to say, oh my God, you better add a little more strengthening here or heavier rigging or that sort of thing. We could still say, take a boat straight off the line and go. Maybe double up your insurance or something like that. But, we will inform the next of kin. And no, that literally they could take a boat off the line and didn't have to worry. And that's been the philosophy all through. And that's really the basic underlying philosophy. And there are very few production boats that really one can say that about. There are possibly one, but most of them one feels have to be modified, and certainly many of them that are promoted as cruising boats have to be severely modified in order to do it. And one of the problems, and we discuss this a lot, is there are a lot of little things you do and you think it's never really going to make any difference, because some of the boats I've seen which have crossed oceans are absolutely horrendous. They made it across. And with reasonable luck, almost any boat can be taken around the world. It really depends more on the person in the boat than on the boat itself. But the trouble is, if you're going to be true to the philosophy of the cruising boat, it's rather like the guy who jumps off a 20-story building, and as he goes down, he passes the first story or the second story, he yells out, "So far I'm fine." It's that last story that matters. So you could sail for 100 years maybe and go round and round the world and never have a bit of problem. Or you might be unlucky and you go out and your first month you might run into that one situation. I can think of a guy who took a good brand of racer cruiser and decided he'd like to sail around Cape Horn. And he set out. And literally the interior of the boat simply started parting company with the hull, so he turned around, came back, and he repaired it, fixed it all up. He went out again. And this was a well-built boat of its type, but it simply was not intended for that sort of service. And the second time he tried to get round, the same thing happened, so he gave up. The cockpit now, on a cruising boat, that's a key element. On a racing boat, it's really somewhere just to park yourself during a race. But as you know very well, on a cruising boat, that really becomes the center of living, and especially on a long cruise, and especially in the tropics, when you don't want to be sitting down below all day. So you have your awning up, and that's where the visiting takes place, and at night probably as many as possible are sleeping in the cockpit or on a sleeping bag on the side deck. And when you're underway in the trade winds and the motion is so gentle, sleeping either on the side deck or in the cockpit is just perfect in perfect weather. The worst that can happen, you get hit by a little flying fish during the night or something like that. So that's the sort of existence, and a cockpit contributes to that. So a comfortable seat in a cockpit becomes important in those conditions when you're going to be, maybe 3 weeks on a passage. A lot of the time sitting in the cockpit, that cockpit had better be at least as comfortable as you can get it. On deck, what we're looking for really is safety. I think we were the first people to put these safety rails around masts on cruising boats, which are a rather heavy item. Yeah, we'd like to save the weight. Rather expensive items. We'd like to save the cost, but to me they're a very important part of working on a boat of that type, because when you're up there by the mast, you don't want to have to cling, in the traditional tragic pose of clinging to the mast in the middle of a shipwreck or something. You want to be able to work with your hands there with the winches or halyards and be able to lean back. And so the space we have between the mast and what we call the fanny bar is fairly accurately gauged to try and arrange it so that people can work with their hands on the rigging. So that becomes important. Not important on a racing boat, important on a cruising boat. Stanchions. We happen to feel that even if only psychologically, having the little bulwark is an important part of it. You don't need it for day sailing, but again, when some unpleasant conditions are around, you've got to handle a sail or something, it's just comforting to know that you can brace your foot against a bulwark, or if you slip down, you're not going to immediately shoot out between the deck and the lower lifeline like a letter into a mailbox or something like that, that you've got something there against which to brace yourself. And for the same reason, several of the boats we've incorporated are molded in king plank, as they call it, on the foredeck, on the center line of the foredeck. And that's not there for decoration, but it means that if you're working on the foredeck, you've got a point there in the middle of the deck that you can brace the edge of your shoe against to give you a little bit of grip. Otherwise, you've just got a wide expanse of deck and nothing much to stop you from one handrail to one safety line to the other. So maybe it'll help a little if you've got something to brace your foot against. The question of leading rigging back to the cockpit, running rigging, that of course has in recent years become important in cruising boats. We'll take a look now at hull shapes, and again that all is part of the general philosophy of the cruising boat. One thing that has happened in recent years is that there are a lot more figures and ratios and so forth being published in magazines and in other publications. And that's good, but it also brings on its own set of problems, because it's so easy to make whatever figures you want favor whatever boat you're promoting at the time. And most of the figures published on boats are far from the truth. I know that the displacement figures published on most boats are quite impossible figures, other than on a custom-built race boat where every item is weighed as it goes aboard. So the problem then that one faces is, if you're going to give a true displacement of a boat, it's going to look heavy compared to the other boats. And the other boats like to show themselves as light, because then it makes all their ratios, like sail area to displacement ratio, look good. And that's very similar to, say, the horsepower per pound of an automobile. So if you can make that look good, you think, boy, that must be a pretty sporty boat, pretty fast boat. Look at the wonderful ratio. But in truth, of course, when the boat is in use, the ratio is nothing like that. This question of language and figures, I was reading, I had mentioned before, I think, in Reader's Digest, that the early people who went, the first settlers to Australia, saw these strange creatures hopping around with long tails and little pouches in front of them. And so they asked the Aborigines there what they called these animals, and they said kangaroo. And so the settlers called them kangaroos, but what they didn't know was kangaroo meant, I don't know. So language and words become extremely important. And you can, for instance, just last week on our radio news, there was an item that in Texas they had a census, and they are giving the population of all the various towns recently, and one town had emerged with a very high ratio of eligible males to females. So quite a few women were moving to that town, and all the figures were true, but what they didn't mention in the census was that there were 6 penitentiaries in that particular area. So when you read statistics, read figures on boats, you've got to treat it with the same sort of suspicion, that you can make any boat look almost any way you want simply by juggling those figures. I mentioned earlier, and this comes into the choice of hull shapes, that really what matters is getting there. And it seems such a trite thing to say, but if you analyze the parts of sailing that you may not like, it's usually, at least partially, the feeling of almost subconscious anxiety when you see the barometer begin to drop, you know, and the needle's going round and round as it plummets. That begins to make you a little apprehensive, and the dark clouds coming up and that sort of thing, and you're more likely to get that in local sailing than you are in ocean sailing, because ocean sailing you have much more long-term prediction on the diurnal ranges and that kind of thing. You can tell what your weather's going to be. But for that, to get away from that feeling, what you want is to be able to feel the old dictum that stay with the boat, that the boat will take care of the person. And that should be true. It's not necessarily true in some of the more modern boats with some of our more efficient hull shapes and our fin keels. But in looking into the beginning of the Pacific Seacraft line, which was still in the relatively early days of cruising sailboats, we especially addressed this problem. And we came, first of all, into the discussion of should one go with what was then still more or less accepted as the average cruising boat, which was a long keel, or should one go with a split underbody? And we spent an enormous amount of time investigating that, because we found that the newer generation of split underbody cruising boats or cruiser racers were good boats, but they did still have some steering problems, according to what we were told, when it came to conditions in heavy weather. So we targeted what I felt was, what is the ultimate danger you could face in a relatively small boat. And I think it is when running before wind and sea, maybe under bare poles, when it's blowing very hard, when you don't look aft at the waves, you look up at the waves, and they're breaking, and you're running down the face of them. That's probably, and it's not going to happen very often, probably never happen to most, but if a boat can remain under control under those conditions, then one has got something. If you're designing a racing boat, and if that boat is not sailing close to the edge of disaster most of the time, then you haven't done your job as a designer. You're not interested in whether the crew is more comfortable than the other boat, or interested only in whether they're faster than the other boat. On a cruising boat, it's reversed. When we looked at the aft end of the underbody, we said, what do we want there? What would we really like to have? We're not interested in getting 1 square foot less wetted surface in the skeg, which might make a difference of a second a mile, which is important when racing, when cruising, it's inconsequential. What we wanted that skeg to do was to be devoted primarily to directional stability. So first of all, it had to be bigger, partially to provide protection for a propeller, which you must have on a cruising boat. A propeller cannot be left in the open. Secondly, we thought if we could design that skeg so that when a boat was running down the face of a wave, as you know, when you're running down the face of a wave like that and you're surfing, sooner or later you begin to feel that stern start to slip sideways a little, here it goes. And what you're worried about is you'll continue that slide and it'll develop into a broach and you'll get rolled. So the skeg on these boats, started with 37, is designed with an extremely high lift section with more resistance than the average skeg. Because what you want some resistance, a little bit of drag right aft there. And what happens there, we estimated the angle of attack as the stern starts to slide down a wave, that skeg now develops a very high lift for its area, pulling the stern back towards the center line. In other words, it's trying to correct any tendency to broach. The textbooks are hopelessly wrong on this whole question of balance. All the positions they tell you to put your sails and the center of effort and that kind of thing are laughably off. Now they've changed, and we've watched them. Ours are completely different, and we've watched them get closer and closer to where we put ours. And now they're within 1 or 2 percentage points, so we no longer have that advantage. But anyway, that's the question of balance. But the reason why I stress it is that on a cruising boat, this becomes a very integral part of the whole performance of the boat. It is so important, especially with small crews, with couples, that a boat is easy to steer. We had a call from a couple in Florida. I mentioned to somebody I was talking to last night, and they'd just taken delivery of their 37. They were kind of excited because they'd cruised a lot, but they'd entered a race and won their first race in it. And the husband was on the phone. He said, "But I've got a complaint. In all the years we've cruised together, I could never get my wife to take a turn on the helm." He said, "Now I can't get a turn myself. I can't get her off it." Because it was a revelation to her to find that a boat could be sailed without you having to be terribly strong to do it. So if you're going to go on a passage on a cruising boat, the question of balance and motion is vital. Motion, the one thing that affects motion of a boat more than any other single factor is weight, just sheer weight. And unfortunately, it is so. There are other factors, hull shapes enter into it. The traditional Colin Archer type, which I don't happen to like particularly myself, or the Block Island with a fine stern, there you will tend to get some hobby horsing, and so that will affect motion. But overall, if you have a heavy boat, you've got so much inertia that it's impossible for that boat to react quickly to each wave. It develops a slow rolling motion of its own, a slow pitch. Let's take a quick look at ends of hulls, because they really are as important in many ways as the middle. The bow and the stern. First of all, the bow is, comparatively speaking, not that important. Really, its main purpose is if you didn't have a bow, you'd have a big hole at the forward end of the waterline, so you've got to have a bow. But what really determines the motion of a hull in the water is much more the stern. The shape of the stern can have a considerable effect on the pitching motion of a boat. If you don't have reserve buoyancy in the stern, you don't have that factor which reduces the amount of pitching, which is, as the bow rises, the stern squats a little in the water, you suddenly pick up extra buoyancy there, that tends to dampen out the pitching motion. What shape of stern? I would love to be able to tell you that the canoe stern is incomparable and that nothing else comes even close. I can't honestly say that. What you can say is that any type of stern done well is a good stern. But I still believe that overall, for the purpose of the boat, for dealing with those ultimate situations, the canoe stern to me has some minor advantages. Secondly, or is it thirdly, I freely admit that it's partly emotional, and boats are an emotional thing. I can remember when I was a kid, the first boat I looked at, cruising boat, that I ever really fell in love happened to have a canoe stern. I can still remember his name and the coloring and everything on the boat. Maybe at that stage I decided I liked canoe sterns. But when I was designing wood boats in the early days, on a wood boat, a canoe stern is a difficult and expensive type of stern to build. And when fiberglass came along, I thought, now I can do canoe sterns. So that was how the canoe stern developed. Also, as I say, I believe it has some advantages. The principal advantage, I think, first of all, what is a canoe stern? And I think it's never really clearly been defined, but a canoe stern is not necessarily, okay, let me put it the other way around. A double ender is not necessarily a canoe stern. Though a canoe stern is always a double ender. In fact, I do not know of any other production boat which has a canoe stern in the true meaning of the word. And the key to it, I believe, is, let me just, waterline, aft sheer, I'll get out of your way in a minute, and so we have a stern coming down here, and then we have rudder down there. There we have the keel. Not quite to scale. Now, the key to it is what happens back here at the aft end of the waterline. For instance, if you have a straight double-ender, what we call a lifeboat stern, that ends just about at the aft end of the waterline down in here somewhere. Now there's a key, I don't want to exaggerate, an important line in the bottom of a boat which we call a buttock line. And that is like a slice through the boat off center, which shows the shape of that boat where you've cut the slice. So on our boats, that section, if you like, comes through here and up like that. And that represents coming off the center line, just sawing right through the boat. You try it yourself sometime and you'll see. Then on a double-ender, this line has to end right at the aft end of the waterline, and so it's got to swoop up pretty fast. You know, otherwise, because you can't have a line coming somewhere out here. At the other extreme, a canoe stern with a good overhang, and that overhang is essential. That line now, and I've got it a little out of place, it would actually be a little shallower, comes out and continues out through the stern. Where it crosses the aft end of the waterline with a true canoe stern, it is still running fairly straight before it gives that kick up. Now you'll notice that all these canoe sterns, if you look at it in profile, it's not an even curve down from the deck to the water. And if you see that on a boat, be suspicious. You don't want a nice, pretty smooth curve. What we have is a little bit of a knuckle at the bottom here. And the reason for that is that by so doing, we can continue this buttock line out fairly straight, where it's crossing the ending of the waterline, which enables the water to flow out rather as it would with a regular transom. You get that little bit of flat run. In other words, what you're doing is as far as the water is concerned, you're increasing the effective length of the waterline of the boat, whereas if you have it cut up there, you're actually decreasing the effective waterline length of the boat. Now, if you go in between that and you get a kind of fat canoe stern like that, if you look at the buttock lines on that type of stern, the same thing is happening. It is cutting back in there and effectively slightly shortening, and this is an oversimplification, shortening the effective waterline length of the boat. So it is tempting to shorten that overhang because from a purely commercial point of view, its hull, which is not really a great deal of use other than its effect there and providing that extra buoyancy. You can't put accommodation there. You can have a little locker in there. But if you had a shorter, fatter stern, you would have virtually the same amount of room in a boat, which is maybe 1 foot shorter. But from a point of view of effectiveness, and it is that sort of thing that comes in heavy weather conditions. When you're running down the face of a wave and you're exceeding your theoretical hull speed, the last thing you want is to start pulling up a quarter wave behind you, because pulling up a quarter wave behind you makes waves behind you start breaking. And under those conditions, that's what you're trying to avoid. Under those conditions, you're probably towing whatever you can get hold of. I've towed tanks, gas tanks on a warp behind me, anything to cause drag, some sort of a temporary sea anchor, and that's towed well behind because, again, you don't want to cause turbulence, or you tow ropes and a bight makes an effective thing. So you're running down, you want to pacify that water behind you, keep it as calm and placid as you can, do nothing to irritate it and start it breaking. So the effective shape of the stern becomes extremely important that way. If you get stability, for instance, and the easiest way is to add a lot of beam. As many of you know, you can have that stability, but if anything happens, you never do go all the way over, which is probably never going to happen, but again, one has to say, what if? If you do go over, it's going to be much harder to get a beamy boat back again, and that was, of course, one of the problems in the Fastnet race of years ago when they had all those tragedies and lives lost, was that the very fat boats developed under the rule, when they rolled over, they were there. They weren't going to come back again. They were very happy lying upside down because of that enormous beam. A narrower boat, the wave action is going to bring it back the normal way. And if you've stuck with the boat, you've got rattled around inside, but you'll be all right, you'll survive. It is not necessarily worthwhile looking for saving every pound you can in the rigging of a sailing yacht. It'll help you in local sailing fractionally, but it will not help the ultimate safety of the boat. And still, one always has to be dragged back in one's enthusiasm for adopting, you know, whatever may be a more efficient way by that final criterion, what is going to keep the people alive if the worst should happen. And that really has to be what drives the cruising boat. Comfort, I think, in all its aspects has to be one of the driving forces, and you do want, I think, a certain amount of efficiency, a certain amount of sailing ability in the hull, because I think what one has to do in looking at cruising is to give yourself permission to have fun. And that may seem a strange thing to say, but there's an awful lot of people are driven when cruising, and it's great for a short cruise, but they feel they've got to get there a day earlier. And, you know, if they just hang on tonight, you know, no, we won't reef, I know the barometer's dropping and all that kind of thing, but we'll keep going. And then so everybody's a little edgy. But on a long passage, it is much better to enjoy the passage and relax and arrive a day later when cruising than it is to press on, strain the boat, strain the gear. Remember, a racing boat goes out on a race, it comes back, it's probably retuned and the sails have gone over. A cruising boat, you may be out there for a year and you never get your rigging tuned, you never, because you don't have the opportunity, your sails have to go maybe several years without being touched, and all the other systems on the boat. So that brings one to perhaps one of the last items, just looking at the overall makeup of the boat and the systems. I won't get into details of systems because they're very individual things. And it really reflects very much the outlook of the owner. There are some people who are very good technically and they like to get involved in a relatively high-tech boat. If you're not one of those people, then my advice would be as simple as possible. I think if you can't at least make an effort at repairing most of what you have, probably it's the time to at least think about whether you should have that particular item. I can only say that it's all, the item by itself is highly desirable. You know, if it wasn't for people like Thomas Edison, we'd still be watching TV by candlelight. So all those innovations are extremely desirable. But when you look at them individually, then you've got to judge. I've never had a radar because of the time when I cruised or all those things. The most we ever had was a little radio receiver, a sextant that was so old that the store didn't sell it to us, they gave it to us, and a used deck watch. And we never had any difficulties, and it was a lot of fun. Yes, now I'd love to have a sat-nav and that kind of thing, but keep it pleasurable. I see possibly in the future the ultimate pleasure, the cruising boat of the future may end up, you'll go down to the dock, you won't have to provision it because you'll punch in a little program on a computer, you'll go back home, sit in front of the TV, and on the right tide time that night your boat takes off, goes to Tahiti, and a year later it comes back, you go aboard, unload the videos and show them to your friends. And none of all this messing around with unpleasant watches and bad weather. And so that is what I wish you all. Thank you for listening.
One final question. In 100 years from now, when people sit around the table and talk about your boats, how would you like your contribution to be remembered?
100 years from now, well, I probably won't be here then. I would say if they had a slight influence on cruising boats of the day, because I know they will not have much influence on cruising boats of tomorrow. You know, things change, and I think it's wrong that something should get embedded in the nautical scene and then be, you know, kept just for its own sake. Though there are certain, I like some of the traditional boats very much indeed. I love some of the traditional work boats. I wouldn't necessarily choose them as you know, a prime example of a boat to go cruising in. So if it had some effect, I think that's probably about the most one would ask, or that you know, 100 years from now, none of them will still be afloat. Probably. Well, I don't know. We simply don't know yet. It's quite possible that a well-built fiberglass may be afloat in 100 years. There are certainly a few wood boats afloat, and I know that the first boat we went cruising in, that we crossed the Atlantic in, was built in 1914, and that is still very much in service, in excellent condition, apparently, no dry rot or anything like that, and may well make the century mark. So who knows, the fiberglass boats, some of them won't last long, I know, but I think the well-built ones probably will. That doesn't really answer your question. It's a tough question to answer. Oh, I think I'd just stick with the rather vague answer I gave, that if they had some influence on cruising boats of today and of the next generation, that would be more than enough. And if they didn't, I would quite understand it.